Mr. Kenneth Tiong.
Speaker, Southeast Asia is about 680 million people and a $4 trillion economy. And it is young where we are old. Median age of Malaysia and Indonesia around 31, Vietnam 34, Philippines 27, against our own citizens' median of nearly 44. But youth is a window, not a promise. A demographic window buys a country growth, more workers, not wealth. Since 1990, fewer than 1 in 3 of the world's middle-income economies has made it to high income. The rest are stuck. The region has perhaps 15 to 20 years to get rich before it grows old. Singapore did climb that ladder by hosting, taking in large amounts of foreign investment to make goods and services for foreign markets, but it is now hitting a limit. The markets everyone leaned on are being weaponized. ASEAN still trades with itself only about a fifth as much as it trades with the world, 21% against the European Union's 60%. And about 3/4 of our exports depend on external demand, just as the great powers begin wielding access to their markets as instruments of coercion. A region that produces mainly for markets it does not control can be squeezed at will. And the ground under our strategy is shifting too. Our hub model carries an assumption that the gradient between Singapore and its neighbors in competence, in institutions, and trust is permanent. It is not. Penang firms today do nano-level vision inspection that the world's chip makers buy. A Penang chip designer, Skychip, listed this year 95 times oversubscribed, the largest Malaysian IPO in 16 years. Vietnam is climbing the ladder. For the region, this is great news. For Singapore, whose business model is to be the main place in the region where things work, it is a deadline. Because a hub, unlike an owner, can be bypassed, Indonesia or Vietnam, at even half their potential, has the demographic weight to become the heart of Southeast Asia. And we have to outrun potential resurgent nationalisms that could close doors around us. A Singapore that is merely well-run waypoint, hosting, brokering, never owning anything together with its neighbors, will find that the region learns in time to route around it. So we should help build a Southeast Asian market of genuine middle-class consumers. We do not have one at scale today, because the market we help build is far less likely to be close to us. And we need Singaporeans and Singaporean firms to own a real piece of the value chains that serve it, to be essential to the region and to share in what the region earns. And we must build a deeper and more structural integration with Southeast Asia. Part of what stops us is a posture. In my maiden speech, I asked why Singapore and Malaysia could not build an Airbus together, one enterprise owned by both sides, the way France and Germany anchored theirs. I know the truer hesitations. It is not necessarily that our neighbors cannot execute. Penang's equipment firms and Selangor's chip designers put that to rest. The real reasons are older, memories of past issues, from water to railway lands, a reflex to keep control of anything that matters, and a fear of bets stranded across a border if the politics turns. But if one is skeptical that the gradient between Singapore and its neighbors will last, and I am, then joint industrial policy is what a country should build, while the gradient still favors it. I believe the strongest path to owning things together runs through our closest neighbor, Malaysia. Malaysia's industrial strategy now deliberately targets the design end of semiconductors, setting up the region's first IC design park in Selangor. The integration is happening anyway, by drift. 245 million checkpoint crossings last year, 3/4 of them by land. New instruments in front of us, the Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone and the RTS link. If we can get them right, we can prove a model of structural bilateral integration that we can extend. I will discuss 3 points. First, on the JS-SEZ. This economic zone lets 2 governments run inside a bounded space and experiment. The zone has been a blank slate many have piled their hopes onto. Some ideas put to me were high-tech food-growing zones, an ASEAN Friendship Hospital in Johor, an integrated medical hub on the Shenzhen-Hong Kong model. But hopes need us to bring the zone into greater focus. First, where exactly is the zone? 9 flagship areas have been announced, described at the level of districts, and I have not seen a consolidated boundary map. If one exists, we should publish it. Second, what does a Singapore company receive inside the JS-SEZ over and above the new federal baseline? Malaysia's new incentive framework took effect for manufacturing on March 1st. If the federal incentives are as good as the zones, then there's nothing special about the zone. Third, I believe we should soon sort out with our Malaysian counterparts one SOP to enter the zone and one rulebook. Right now, there are multiple agencies and points of contact. On the Malaysian side, there is the Iskandar Regional Development Authority, Invest Johor, MIDA, and the Invest Malaysia Facilitation Centre Johor, IMFCJ. On the Singapore side, we have the EDB One-Stop Centre. We need policy clarity and joint rules of the road over how companies can enter the zone, whether from Malaysia or Singapore, so that the private sector can plan for it. With a joint rulebook, we should measure joint success. In my view, that means EDB or MTI should be responsible for total KPIs over the JS SEZ, not just the Singapore-originated investments alone. Of course, a large degree of self-interested thinking is inevitable and even desirable. The instinct in parts of our government may be to keep the high-value activity here and let the rest go. This is not wrong. But if we want the unfolding of a richer, more complex, more diverse value chain within a 60-kilometer radius than would currently be possible in 10 and 20 years, then we need to take a more collaborative approach. What gets measured gets managed. I believe we should grade ourselves, EDB and the Ministry, on the SEZ success. Next, we face a strategic question. If the zone is meant to be more than just a new method of foreign direct investment, but to foster a vibrant set of Singaporean and Malaysian businesses in pursuit of broadening the middle class, does it actually build on the current set of bilateral strengths? The foremost candidate for such an industrial deepening is semiconductors. But here, using the instrument of the zone may be an impedance mismatch, as in my view, Penang's semiconductor cluster is unlikely to relocate beyond the Klang Valley. So we will need a broader set of instruments. What can we hope for from semiconductors as joint industrial policy? In Singapore, we host. Our IC design strength is mostly the design centers of foreign firms on our soil. We have not grown a chip design champion of our own, and we sold our indigenous foundry, Chartered Semiconductors. Meanwhile, Malaysia is building some of what we lacked. Its national semiconductor strategy puts indigenous IC design, about half of a chip's value added, at the center, with 25 billion ringgit behind it and a 60,000 engineer training goal. Selangor's IC Design Park, the largest in Southeast Asia, turns out hundreds of designers a year. The Penang Design House, whose listing I described, came out of this push. And Singapore's own state-linked capital is already backing Malaysian design startups. We have more reason to complement each other than to compete. Singapore hosts what the region's designers require: wafer fabs to prototype on, advanced packaging, capital, and customers. They hold some of what require, design talent by the hundreds at a fraction of our cost. Neither side has a complete owned upstream stack alone. First, I believe MTI should foster a design to fab to packaging chain that runs through Singapore. Access and equity is one instrument, structured prototyping on the fabs hosted here, and packaging lines tied to a stake for investors, public and private. Since we sold Chartered, we have no fabs of our own. So first, we should allow RIE funds to lease or rent Singapore-based fab lines so that we can put real silicon in front of the region's designers. While those fabs are still under construction, we should use supplemental investments to expand directable fab capacity where possible, prioritizing Singapore businesses, but open to Malaysian ones as well. This, I think, is the best way to validate the viability of a chip design ecosystem while giving it the best chance of success, iterative prototyping feedback inside the same regional corridor, especially if one is understandably hesitant of a full-scale $15 to $20 billion US dollar 2-nanometer fab rebuild. Second, the talent pipeline. Our universities, NTU and NUS, should seek to set up an embedded institute in the Selangor cluster carrying a joint credential, with firms operating on both sides of the zone sponsoring net new training places whose employment options are accessible in Johor, Selangor, and Singapore, producing new engineers for the region. Third, I believe we should recognize in law a Malaysia-Singapore business entity defined by a minimum stake on each side, 30-30, 40-40, 50-50, and give it closer to local, pseudo-local treatment in both countries' grants, financing, and procurements. When people from both countries own part of the same success, each has reason to grow its own capability rather than to poach it. We should seek to create rails that work for a recognized category of bilateral joint firms across the two countries and crowd in the private sector. And fourth, in service of crowding in, we should reactivate the Malaysia-Singapore Business Development Fund. It was set up in 2004 for exactly this, enhanced in 2023, relaunched in 2024. As far as I know, it has not been used. So we should give it a fresh purpose, competitive seed awards into the first recognized Malaysia-Singapore ventures, many small bets, fast answers. Next and third, on the RTS. Integration will arrive as a train in 2027, up to 10,000 passengers an hour each way. Walk our heartland shops today, and you can feel the dread coming. The provision shop, the TCM shop, the noodle shop, the barber, the tailor. They read the same reports we do. There is gallows humor in the shops now about the RTS and what it will do to Singapore retail. And a question, when the RTS opens, what will happen to us? DBS puts a leakage at 1.5 to 2.1 billion Sing dollars a year, 3 to 4% of retail sales every day, with food and personal services hit hardest. 11 million Singaporean trips into Johor in the first 7 months of last year alone validate this. The government's answer so far is to make retail more attractive at home. Visual merchandising programs, placemaking grants, neighborhood center upgrades, vouchers to spend at home. I support these initiatives, but we should be honest with ourselves. For a generation of retailers, it will make little difference. I believe we can offer a different deal. Johor is planning the EART as a dispersal network out of Bukit Chaga, and I speculate that transit-oriented development will be done in the vicinity of their 32 stations. If so, I propose we invest in that plan as part of the JS SEZ bargain. Singapore should take an equity stake in some of these transit-oriented developments the line creates, Bukit Chaga and the 32 EART stations, and negotiate in the same deal reserve positions for small retailers inside these developments, inside the podiums of those malls. This has happened before, when Singapore and Malaysia resolved in 2010 the 20-year impasse over the 1990 points of agreement on the railway lands. It was not settled in cash but in co-ownership. Khazanah and Temasek formed a joint company 60-40 and built Marina 1 and Duo in the city centre. I am proposing a similar instrument. The footfall these developments capture is largely from Singapore, so the deal has logic on both sides. Johor gains a committed capital partner for a network it is building anyway, and we gain a share of where our own spending lands, and place in it for the retailers that spending leaves behind. Thus, we can give every exposed small retailer who rents rather than owns their premises on the order of 40,000, provision shops, eateries, personal care operators, etc., a tradable entitlement, a priority claim on a reserved position in these developments to take up or to assign to another small operator, or for those who would rather not move, a cash floor drawn now or set against rent, enough to fund a real relocation or a year of rent. It should go to the tenant and not the owner of the unit, since the renter carries the lost footfall with nothing to fall back on. Retail is a more protected part of Malaysia's economy, so MFA and MTI will need to negotiate this within the same bargain. Since Malaysia has already carved foreign firms into Forest City, it is not unprecedented. We speak about the stakeholder economy. We can seek this compact if it is possible for small retailers. This is a better deal than the fait accompli they currently await. Speaker, in closing, I do not pretend any of this is inevitable or easy. Foreign economic relations are always challenging, with reduced control and increased unpredictability. But we are in a unique moment with the threat and leverage of market closure from the biggest powers foremost on our minds. And we are also reaching the limits of our growth on 750 square kilometers. It would be a shame if the JS SEZ and the tenor of our future cooperation in Malaysia were predominantly FDI-led, instead of being in service of tackling the true strategic challenges of the decade. The creation of a true middle class in Southeast Asia, and integration of our country to be indispensable to the future economic geometries of our neighbors. An imperative to increase the complexity and diversity of our value chains, and the fostering of a stakeholder economy, and the search of a better bargain for our pioneering generations. This is the model of integration I believe we should seek with the region, one that best maximizes the 15 to 20 years Southeast Asia has before it ages out of its demographic dividend. Thank you, sir.
MOS Alvin Tan.
Sir, to me, the key question of this motion is how do we ensure deeper integration with the region, and in fact, not just ASEAN, but Malaysia, which is additive and not substitutive? And how do we ensure that integration does not simply move activity from Singapore to somewhere else, but also creates value in Singapore and our partners, which would otherwise not be captured? And Singapore has always been open to the world. I think in the transport motion, many of you have already said that. And with investment competition intensifying and supply chains reconfiguring, we must keep building our capabilities, strengthening our businesses, and anchoring high-value activities here in Singapore. Now, the Johor-Singapore SEZ, the BBK, Batam Bintan, Karimun region, and the Vietnam-Singapore industrial parks are all examples that show how we work with our immediate neighbors to enlarge the economic space for our companies and our workers. This is something that Member Edward Chia had said earlier on in his speech. But let me first give an overview about the Johor-Singapore SEZ. It spans about 3,500 square kilometers, includes Iskandar Development Region and Pengerang. And I wanted to point to the member that, in fact, the boundaries of the JS SEZ is available online. But the whole point about the JS SEZ is about creating value together that neither side would have created or captured alone. Singapore has strong connectivity, trusted institutions, deep financing, technology, professional services, HQ functions, and a skilled workforce. Johor, on the other hand, offers land, production capacity, and other complementary strengths. But when we combine these strengths well, the Johor-Singapore region becomes more competitive than either side would be on its own. Member talked about whether there are so many different touch points, but in fact, if you look at it, on the Malaysia side, there is, as he mentioned, the IMFJ, the Invest Malaysia Facilitation Center, which facilitates and supports companies investing in the zone, such as coordinating approvals and applications across Malaysian authorities at the federal, state, and local level. In Singapore, we also have a joint Johor-Singapore SEZ project office, which helps Singapore and Singapore-based companies explore twinning opportunities in the JS SEZ. I've gone through many of these workshops, and both offices work hand in hand together to facilitate investments coming through to Johor and to the zone, and from Singapore to the zone. And both sides have also introduced measures to reduce friction and improve connectivity, including in immigration clearance, customs facilitation, and cargo processes. Now, the refreshed Johor-Singapore Cooperation Ministerial Committee, co-chaired by Minister Chee Hong Tat and Malaysian Minister for Economy Akmal Nasrullah, will also provide strategic oversight for broader cooperation, including in the SEZ. On the reason why we are pursuing this and how this is a core strategy in integrating with the region, the Johor-Singapore SEZ is all about tapping our complementary strengths for a win-win outcome. The Johor-Singapore SEZ is focused on the Johor-Singapore corridor and building on the respective incentives and schemes offered by each country. Both countries are working on introducing practical solutions like smoother cross-border flow of goods and people. And in Singapore, for Singapore companies, the true value is able to twin operations, keeping the HQ functions, financing, innovation, branding, and higher value functions in Singapore while using Johor's complementary strengths to scale more competitively. But I understand the concerns also that deeper integration could move activities out of Singapore. But I think, as the member alluded, we cannot also accommodate every activity within Singapore. Instead, our approach has and always been to keep Singapore as a key node while helping our companies scale and build resilience so that they can compete globally. Now, this means organizing activities, practical, meaningful activities across both sides of the causeway, so we can continue to play to our strengths as a financial, transport, and tech hub. And also to anchor HQ functions, R&D, intellectual property, talent development, and other high-value activities here. I'll give you two practical examples. Old Chang Kee, which is a food manufacturer in Singapore, has operated a production facility in Geylang Patah since 2016, complementing its Singapore operations and supporting its retail outlets in both markets. South Korea's SPC Group, the parent company of Paris Baguette and Shake Shack, houses its Southeast Asia HQ, Innovation Center, and training centers in Singapore while operating its production base in Johor. And then we move into semiconductors, which the member had talked about quite significantly. Singapore is a key node in the global semiconductor value chain. We account for 1 out of 5 in every semiconductor equipment manufacturing and 1 out of 10 of semiconductor chips. And we will keep strengthening Singapore's position as a key node in this global semiconductor value chain by attracting quality investments and anchoring higher value activities here. So our strategy is not to replicate what is being done in Johor or Penang, but to work with Malaysia on complementary activities that strengthen the regional ecosystem for semiconductors, which is a very fast and evolving sector. Another example here to illustrate this point is ST Microelectronics, which anchored its APAC HQ and wafer fab operations in Singapore, complemented by assembly and test operations, including high reliability automotive packaging in Johor. Their wafers fabricated in Singapore directly feed into packaging and qualification in Malaysia, enabling ST Microelectronics to bring products to markets faster. Member also talked about how we measure these investments, or what are the key KPIs for the Johor-Singapore SEZ. Well, the Johor-Singapore SEZ must deliver real investments, business activity, and jobs. Singapore and Malaysia have jointly agreed to attract 50 projects in 5 years and 100 projects in 10 years. It's so far garnered significant and strong business interest. Last year, Johor recorded its highest ever approved investments, with over 70% of those investments attributed to the zone. And since signing the MOU in January 2024, Singapore and Singapore-based companies have committed over $5.5 billion in investments into Johor. So we're not just focused on the headline investment numbers, but whether the SEZ expands the overall pie for the region and for Singapore and Johor together competing for investments. On the RTS link, I chair the RTS link task force to help Singaporeans and businesses benefit from the RTS link. And we've been widely engaging residents, merchants, trade associations, landlords, and other stakeholders. Now, based on the feedback we received, we are working on measures to further rejuvenate our heartlands, help our businesses become more competitive, transform, pivot, and work with the private sector to promote businesses and commerce on both sides. Some of the work has already begun on the ground. We've spoken to the private sector players on both sides, and I think this is something which we can promote further to ensure that commerce flows on both sides. We will be sharing our findings and recommendations later this year. But I think we should be clear about the broader point. The way to respond to greater connectivity is not to retreat from competition, as the member had alluded to, but to help our businesses to compete more effectively. Competition doesn't just come across from the causeway. It already comes from digital platforms, international brands, AI-enabled services, e-commerce, and changing consumer preferences. On his suggestions about these different deals with the Malaysians, I think it's within their jurisdiction. I think we do what we can under the auspices of the JSSEZ to ensure that our companies can invest there confidently and also anchor strong and high-value activities here, complementing both Singapore and Malaysia, Singapore and Johor. So the issue that we talked about this entire day, in fact, is not whether we should integrate with the region, but how we integrate with the region. And the test is not whether every activity must be located here. Of course, that would be unrealistic with our constraints, but whether Singapore remains where the highest value functions are anchored and where important decisions are made, where we can build capabilities and where we ultimately can create good jobs for Singaporeans. And if a company does choose the Johor-Singapore region instead of another location elsewhere in Asia and anchors its HQ functions, financing, innovation, and R&D activities in Singapore, then I think that's additive integration. And if our companies can use Johor as a complementary base to scale, serve larger markets, and strengthen their regional competitiveness while retaining their core capabilities here, that's also additive integration. And if our region as a whole becomes more attractive to global investors and Singapore captures the higher value parts of that value chain, that's also additive integration. And this is the approach, Mr. Speaker, that we are taking to ensure that regional integration benefits Singapore and Singaporeans. Thank you.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn. Those who agree say aye. Aye. Those who disagree say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.